Good afternoon, everyone. This is Chris Judge coming to you remotely from the Indian Land campus of the University of South Carolina, Lancaster. We got Elizabeth Avalar in the command center down in Lancaster, and we have Chris Moore coming from Aiken today. Before we get started with today's lecture, next month, our May Lunch and Learn lecture speaker is Dr. Peter Fernando from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. His lecture is Rich from the Sea, Florida Native Americans Wrecking in the 16th Century, the fourth Friday of the month. That will be a virtual lecture as well, just as we have this month. This month for our W. Brent Bergen Lunch and Learn lecture series, we have my friend and colleague, Christopher Moore, from the Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology on the USC campus down in Columbia. He's also director of the Southern Paleoamerican Survey. Chris has a BS in anthropology from Appalachian State University. He has an MA from East Carolina University in anthropology, and he holds a PhD in coastal geoscience from East Carolina University. Chris looks at site formation processes and geochronology and is looking at the oldest Native Americans to live in the Southeast United States. He's a hardcore scientist. He approaches the archaeological record with a lot of scrutiny and looking at how things are buried, how they get buried, and what context they're found in. Today, he's going to talk about a really interesting project. Blood residue analysis of Paleoamerican stone tools in North Carolina. And without further ado, please make welcome Christopher Moore.
Great. Well, I appreciate that, and I'm honored to be a part of this lecture series today. I am going to be talking about some recent blood residue work that I was involved with a bunch of my co-authors, and was published in Nature Scientific Reports last year. Okay, I'm trying to, So I always like to start out these lectures talking about something that during the last glacial maximum 20,000 years ago, North America really rivaled Africa with regard to large megafauna. We had massive animals, mastodon and mammoth, ground sloth, cave bear. People don't think about we had camels in North America. We had saber-toothed cats. One of the things I like to talk about is if you were to bring a Paleo-Indian, a Paleo-American Clovis person into the present time, they would look around at our environment, and in many ways they would see, from their perspective, a devastated landscape, right? At the loss of these mega herbivores, the megafauna that existed in North America during the last glacial maximum and up to around 12,800 years ago. And then we had a really massive extinction event, possibly not all at once, but certainly around 12,800 years ago, at the beginning of what's called the Younger Dryas Climate Event. We had a really massive amount of extinctions occur in North America. So it's really transformed the environment. When you remove these animals, you remove animals that are affecting the landscape, and they're affecting the creation of grasslands, the forest ecosystem. Everything is transformed. And so when we've lost these animals, we've really transformed North America as Paleo-Americans would have known it. So Paleo-Indian hunter-gatherers, likely hunted large Ice Age animals, such as mammoth or mastodon. And lacking bone, which we don't really have very good bone preservation. In fact, we have really no bone preservation from the time period of the extinction, 12,800 to 13,000 years ago. So lacking that bone, is there any way to tell if these animals were being hunted by Paleo-Americans? And as you see on the left here, you can see an artistic rendition of Paleo-Americans hunting a mammoth. One of them is getting stomped by the mammoth. Of course, I always have to put in my Gary Larson cartoon. Everybody loves Gary Larson. It's hard to imagine that they hunted these large animals. but we know from sites out west that they did, at least occasionally, hunt these animals. The question is, in the southeast, certainly outside of Florida, in the northeast, in the southeast region, were these animals around during the early Paleoamerican period of Clovis, and were they being hunted? So immunological blood residue analysis is a method that has been applied successfully to detect residues on stone tools. And so when I first heard about this, I saw a report on Cactus Hill site in Virginia by Joe McAvoy. And in his report, in the appendix, right in the back, was a report by Margaret Newman, where she did blood residue analysis on some of the tools from Cactus Hill. And they found evidence of bison and other things. And I thought, that was pretty cool and something that we probably should try to replicate, right? So when I first heard about it, to me, what this was, I wanted to know, is this science? Is this real science, or is this science fiction? Right? And so, I'm an archaeologist. I'm not an immunologist, but I thought this would be something cool to apply to prehistoric stone tools in South Carolina, in North Carolina and surrounding states. So how are these blood protein residues found on stone tools? The method used here is called crossover immunoelectrophoresis, which I've had to practice saying that in order to get it right. CIEP. It's been used in forensic medicine for more than 50 years in crime scene investigations. Starting about 25 years ago, the method was experimentally applied to the analysis of protein residues preserved on and within stone tools. Margaret Newman, who did my initial work, which I'll discuss, was the pioneer of this method for looking at stone tools. And so when we talk about blood residues on stone tools, we're not talking about actual preserved blood. We're talking about remnants of blood proteins that have been absorbed into microfractures within the stone tool itself. If you've ever seen flint knappers when they're chipping and flaking a stone tool, when they're doing that, it's producing fractures. It's producing microscopic fractures in the rock, and that will allow the blood to be absorbed up into these residues through capillary uptake. So CIEP uses anti-sera, or antibodies derived from living animals, to test for proteins, also called linear epitopes, extracted from stone tools. So how are the proteins extracted? Here's a Clovis point I did a number of years ago from Fort Bragg. And what they do is they apply a weak ammonia solution to the outside of the tool. And then they put the tool in a little plastic weigh boat that sits in an ultrasonic cleaner. And the ultrasonication process, along with the ammonia solution, pulls out these residues that are within the fractures of the rock, right? And here we have, this is Margaret Newman. She was the pioneer of this method. Here she is taking the residues that were extracted from the stone tools during ultrasonication. She's adding those residues and the antibodies from living animals into a gel substrate. And then this electrophoresis process goes on for 30 minutes, 130 volt, and it causes the modern antibodies from living animals to migrate in the direction of where they put the stone tool residues, if you have a positive reaction. So here's an example. You can see the area that's circled. The antibodies from the living animals are on the right, and the blood residues extracted from tools are on the left, and it'll form a visible precipitate that will connect the two if you have a positive immuno reaction. So closely paired antigens and anti-sera again form this visible precipitate, and that's how we know we have a positive hit. That's how we know, for example, one of the things I'm interested in as an archaeologist is obviously, as I discussed, megafauna that lived here during the Ice Age. Well, to compare for elephant or to compare for mammoth or mastodon, we use antibodies derived from modern African elephants, right? And so that's how this process works. So, having seen that, having seen the earlier work that was done, I was working at Flamingo Bay on the Savannah River site. It's a Carolina Bay, and up on the sand rim, we have a wonderful multi-component site with lots of stone tools. We had been working there for a number of years. Of course, when we find the tools, we pick them up, take them back to the lab, wash them, sometimes brush them off. That was something that I wanted to do a little bit different for this analysis. So we have numerous Clovis tools, early archaic artifacts, 10 to 13,000 year age artifacts coming out from the sand rim at Flamingo Bay. Here are some of the field crew from the Savannah River Archaeology program working there at 2010 and 2011. In 2010, we found the base of this incredible green vitric tuff Clovis point at Flamingo Bay. It's made from, like I said, an exotic green welded tuff, like we see from the central North Carolina slate belt. It's the first Clovis recovered from buried context within a Carolina Bay sand rim. So we knew we had a great site there. We were coming up with numerous specialized tools that we associate with Clovis, unifacial tools with graver spurs, spoke shaves on flakes that were often used in what I call the haft and shaft process, right? These are tools that are used to work and shape bone or wood in the creation of the implements for hafting stone tools. Again, here we have the image of Paleoamerican hunter-gatherers attacking a mammoth. We don't know that this Clovis that was found at Flamingo, we didn't know what it was used for, and certainly wanted to try to find that out. But we also wanted to test lots of other tools from Flamingo Bay and elsewhere. So in 2013, we went back to Flamingo Bay, and I wanted to excavate and actually pull artifacts out of the ground without touching them. And I always bring this up because this is a really hard thing to do. Everybody, when you find something, of course, we document it exactly in 3 dimensions, and we draw it, we photograph it, but we want to pick it up and hold it in our hand, right? We want to touch it. It's sort of a visceral experience of an archaeologist to be able to hold something. You're the first person to hold that artifact since it was made up to 13,000 years ago. So that's a pretty cool experience. But for this study, for the initial study, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to pull these out of the ground without touching, without washing, in order to prevent any possibility of contamination, right? You're always fearful of some protein contamination getting on the artifact. Here we have a large bifacial knife that we found at Flamingo. We have a large in situ side scraper coming out of the ground on the lower left. Here we have one of our field crew from the Savannah River program, and she's holding this large bifacial knife in her hand on a plastic bag, right? So this wasn't physically touched by our hands or washed. This, along with a lot of other artifacts, were part of this initial pilot study that I did in 2013. And so the initial results, among others, the thing that really struck me right away is we got bovid or bison residue coming off this large bifacial knife. And, I thought that was pretty dang cool, to be able to find that when we don't have any physical evidence in the form of bones of these animals anywhere in the Southeast, outside of Florida. So I also tested a number of Clovis and other Paleoamerican points, early archaic points, all the way up to the woodland in this initial study. And you can see I'm getting bison often and early. I'm getting cat. We can't say what kind of cat. It could be a saber tooth. It could be a mountain lion. We don't know. The immunological test that is used It's not DNA, and so we can't make that distinction. And in fact, DNA may or may not even be preserved, even when we can get positive or negative reactions using the immunological method. DNA is not necessarily going to be there. But the interesting pattern we were getting cat and bison, which sort of go together in terms of, if you think about it ecologically, if you have large herds of bison existing on the landscape 12, 13,000 years ago, you're probably going to have predators, right? And that might have been things like mountain lion, possibly saber-toothed cat, things like that. So these results we were getting from the pilot study were consistent in ecologically, in terms of our understanding of our expectations for what we might see. And later on in 2015, I did a bigger study looking at more spear points, actually whole spears and knives from the Savannah River site and from local collectors that allowed me to take their artifacts and test them. And when I did, our numbers jumped up. We increased the number of the same pattern that we were seeing. Bison was the leading positive residue that we were getting in the Paleo-Indian period. We're seeing it in the early Archaic, and the last place we see it is in the Middle Archaic period, approximately 7,500 years ago on Mara Mountain points. We have 2 hits on that for bison. And in this study, in the later Archaic period and the Woodland period, we didn't get any evidence of bison. Doesn't mean that it's not there, but it's certainly interesting that this and later studies, as we'll talk about, that have been done, actually don't show a bison after around 7,500 years ago, even though there's in the ethnohistoric record, there's early colonial accounts of herds of bison in the Carolinas, which is really interesting. 1600s, early 1700s, they talk about herds of bison, yet we've never found a bison bone confirmed from that time period. So I don't know exactly what's going on there. I think that's an interesting question. It's a secondary question to what I'm going to talk about later, but it's one that I certainly want to pursue with additional testing of later prehistoric artifacts. And you'll notice, before I move on, in this image, for the Paleoamerican period, we don't have any evidence of mastodon or mammoth, horse or camel, or any of these other megafauna that we think may have existed during that time period before extinction. Here's a map that I put together showing some of the Clovis and later period Paleoamerican points. You can see on the lower left, we've got a beautiful coastal plain chert, Clovis. It actually had 3 residues. It had cat, it had bovid or bison, and it had rabbit. And we see that on some tools, we get multiple residues, rabbit being actually fairly common. And having talked to several folks who primitive technology experts, rabbit certainly would have been a common animal that would have been acquired. And I think potentially used rabbit skin and sinew would have probably been one of the more common animal products used to actually haft the stone tool, right? So that may be what we're seeing with a rabbit, at least in some cases. Certainly they were eating rabbits and they were hunting rabbits. I'm not sure they were hunting them with large Clovis points, but certainly they were eating them, they were using them. And I think hafting is certainly possibly one of the things we're seeing on the Paleoamerican points is the hafting residues, where these were affixed to a foreshaft of wood or bone. You'll notice cat is also common on several of these, as well as bear. Here's a beautiful Clovis. It came back with deer and rabbit. And the interesting thing about this point, it actually at the tip has an impact fracture that looks like a sort of a reverse flute or flake. And this is where this artifact hit something very hard, like bone perhaps. when it was used for hunting. So that's pretty interesting. Here we have a Clovis that's been reworked into sort of a fairly unusual sort of chisel or punch of some sort. And this is from Allendale County, South Carolina. And this came back with bear residue. So, you know, we're seeing a diversity of animals. Some of them, at least on all the initial studies, with the exception of bison, at least in the southeast, these are all extinct. These are living animals that are alive today. So we haven't seen evidence for the extinct animals that we're really trying to address that question for Clovis in particular. So in North America, we have at least 14 megafauna kill sites, all dating to around 13,000 years ago, that are currently known. Right, and so that's not that many, but I think mostly that's really telling us a lot about preservation. All of these sites are out in the Midwest and out western United States, in the Carolinas and much of the Southeast. We simply don't have bone preservation. The soils are acidic. The bones are eaten away. They don't survive. But in other areas, in certain environments, if you have anaerobic environments where the oxygen is depleted, such as in peat bogs or other types of swamp environments, you might have the potential to have preservation. But we have yet to find a kill site dating to the Paleoamerican period in the Carolinas ever. So these are the ones that are known for North America. A very small number, but again, probably only related to preservation. So again, where's the evidence for megafauna exploitation by Clovis in the Southeast? And one of the questions when I did the initial pilot study and we didn't find evidence for extinct megafauna, and we did several other, additional studies, and we never found anything beyond bison. And so I was wondering, I was talking with my other co-authors, and I was asking, is it possible in our area in the Southeast were megafauna like mastodon and mammoth and those, were they already extinct regionally? We know they were around in the Western US and were being hunted at least occasionally by Clovis, but were they possibly extinct in the Southeastern US? And maybe even prior to Clovis. There's certainly debates going on about pre-Clovis occupation of North America, pre-Clovis occupation of the Southeast. Humans in North America may have been interacting with these megafauna for thousands of years before Clovis. Maybe some of these animals were pushed to extinction before Clovis came into the Carolinas. And so that was one of the questions that I was looking at and wanted to try to answer with additional blood residue work. And again, data from the work that had been done already on stone tools showed that Paleoamericans and early archaic hunter-gatherers appeared to be heavily targeting bison. And maybe that's really no surprise given that we know that bison will form large herds, probably in much more greater numbers than some of the other megafauna that have lower birth rates and generally don't have as many animals around. So none of the bison residues have been found after 7,500. That's a question I certainly want to address with future work. This future work will include testing of late prehistoric artifacts, later archaic, Savannah River, all the way through woodland arrow points and triangular points. We need to get a bigger sample, right? We need, so it's possible. The real issue here is the sample size for the blood residue work that's been done simply isn't big enough to find bison in the later prehistoric period. One thing I didn't mention is that in general, the blood residue, you're only going to get about 20% of the artifacts that you submit for testing are actually going to produce any residue at all, which probably has to do with preservation of these protein residues within the microfractures. You don't always get it. So that's something that requires a big sample. And so with that in mind, certainly, and with my focus being on megafauna, really understanding if there's any evidence of megafauna in the southeast. In May of 2022, I went around the state in North and South Carolina, and I gathered 120 Paleoamerican spear points and tools from artifact collectors who are willing to let me borrow their art, take their artifacts. Fort Jackson Museum, the Lawrence Museum, Hampton County Museum, Southeastern Paleoamerican Survey at SKIA, the University of South Carolina. We have these collections. And so I pulled all of these points together. And I like to tell this story very quickly, but these aren't things that I can just put in the mail, right? They're too valuable from a scientific perspective, and certainly from the collectors who generously let me use their artifacts. And so what I did, I flew these in a Pelican box, a really protective box on the flight on my person at all times to Portland to have this work done. So I had to get advance permission from TSA. And of course, they thought I was crazy, but they opened the box when I went through the security. There's cloves, knives in there that long. But I got permission from TSA to take these stone knives on the plane and make sure that they would safely be transported to Portland where we could do the analysis, right? And again, the focus of this study was to look for the presence of these extinct megafauna such as mammoth and mastodon and horse and camel that we had failed to find in earlier studies. And so we did the analysis when I was out there, flew everything back. We got the results back. The red stars on this map show the areas where we were able to get artifacts, Paleoamerican artifacts for testing. And as far as I know, this constitutes the largest single blood residue study on Paleoamerican artifacts probably ever conducted. And out of 120 artifacts, 18 actually came back positive for extinct megafauna. Only 18. Where previous studies with smaller samples of artifacts had failed to find evidence. This large study finally gave us evidence that I was looking at and looking for. And here is the evidence. You can see the location, the blue and green and red dots show the locations where in the counties where we have Paleoamerican artifacts that came back positive for equidae or horse. People don't often think about horse being hunted, but certainly the Ice Age horse that was here in North America were probably very common, much like bison. Bovid is, again, the dominant type of residue that we find. And then the one that I was really interested in seeing if we were going to find is Proboscidean, which is mammoth or mastodon. And so we got 5 hits out of those 18 that came back for Proboscidean, which I thought, is really cool and really exciting to see that evidence finally come forward after doing several of these studies. Here we have the 4 artifacts, including one from North Carolina that Dr. Randy Daniels sent me to test. These all came back positive for horse, equidae or horse. So the Steen family in South Carolina graciously allowed me to take some of their artifacts, and one of them came back with horse, and so that's pretty cool to see that. Again, bison, we had 9 artifacts out of the 18 tested positive for bovid or bison, and these include Oxford Clovis, redstone, lower left with the full fluted redstone. We have a possible, this sort of unknown type, Hall River type on the lower right that came back positive for bison. So it's really, we don't know the age. It's possible it's Clovis age or earlier. We don't know yet. And here we have the 5 artifacts that came back positive for Proboscidean. This is the first evidence or first direct evidence of human exploitation of extinct megafauna species for South Carolina during Clovis and possibly pre-Clovis times. The point D from Allendale County is a Haw River Point. The Southeastern Paleoamerican Survey, along with myself and Al Goodyear and others, are working on trying to understand what Haw Rivers represent, how old they are. This doesn't tell us that exactly, but getting Proboscidean on Haw River is a pretty good indication that they're probably at least as old as Clovis, and maybe older. So that was pretty interesting. And you'll see on the right this massive, beautiful exotic chert biface was found by Ben Ziegler in Williamsburg County. That one came back also positive for Proboscidean. We did microwear analysis. Larry Kimball, Appalachian State did microwear on the tool. We have incredible butchery polish that he's able to see microscopically on the sides of the tool. We have hafting traces at the bottom of the tool that can be seen. We have sheath wear traces, which is something that is rarely seen on the flat part of the tool, where this tool was probably hafted as probably a big handheld knife, and it was probably kept in a animal skin leather sheath. And so when they were putting it in and out of the sheath over and over again, it developed sheath wear traces that we can identify, that Larry was able to identify by doing an experiment, right? He experimentally replicated tools. He used all sorts of butchery of animals, putting them in a sheath, and then looking at the traces that result. And so we've got both blood residue and microwear evidence. What we think is actually a Clovis tool. It has basal thinning. It has really invasive, very thin flaking across the face of the tool. It looks to be set up for fluting, but I think, having looked at the tool, I think they decided not to do any other than basal thinning, which you can see on the drawing on the left. I think they didn't do the typical fluting on this because it's so thin. I think it would have broke. I think it would have broke immediately had they tried to do the traditional fluting on this point. So we do interpret this as a likely large Clovis knife. So always in this, what have we learned? Well, one of the things we learned, the hypothesis that I initially had, or I was wondering about were megafauna extinct in the Southeast, we've learned that they were not. They were here. They were being hunted by Paleoamericans, by Clovis, by later Paleo-Indian groups, Redstone groups. They were being hunted or butchered, or scavenged even. Bison were around, were heavily targeted. We've learned that from several studies, and that continues up into at least the mid-Holocene, 7,500 years ago. That's something that we want to test with additional work. We also want to do additional testing of Paleoamerican artifacts. The particular artifacts that immediately post-date Clovis in South Carolina, North Carolina, that's the Redstone Point that has the full fluting that goes up the middle of the point and has the really deeply incurvated base. So I need a much bigger sample, because one of the interesting patterns is we get Proboscidean, mammoth or mastodon, on Clovis. We don't get it on Redstone. We get horse on Redstone. And so now I'm wondering, are we seeing any evidence from the blood residue of the timing of extinction, right, between Clovis and Redstone? Well, we don't know yet because we don't have a big enough sample. It's interesting to think about, but much like the previous hypothesis that I had about megafauna being extinct prior to Clovis, we need a much bigger sample. So stay tuned for future studies, future large blood residue studies on post-Clovis, Paleoamerican points, Redstone, Dalton, and then for the question about how long did bison survive in the Southeast, we need to look at the late prehistoric artifacts. We need to look at a lot more late Archaic and woodland Mississippian time period. Did keep blood residue on those as well. So finally, I want to thank Sean Taylor and South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, the Heritage Trust Program, South Carolina, for supporting all of this blood residue work that I've done. So many people were involved. The Steen family, Andrew Bowen, Johnny Causey, LeClaire, Lafitte, Marianne Sowell at the Hampton County Museum, the Lawrence County Museum, Amy Bresnahan at Dominion Energy, Southeastern Paleoamerican Survey provided a lot of artifacts. Al Goodyear did that. Chan Funk before Jackson, John Arena, Jim Legg, Ben Ziegler, John Comar, Chris Young, Dennis Hendricks, and Philip Wright. And I want to emphasize that a lot of these guys are avocational collectors, and they trusted me to take their artifacts, fly them to Portland, and do this study. So this couldn't have been done without their help. So I want to certainly extend sincere appreciation to everyone who did that. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I've seen this lecture a couple times, and each time I'm in awe of the research you're doing and the unbelievable results that you're finding. If anybody on the Zoom call has a question, if you would put it into the chat, I will serve them up to Chris. We already have one. It says, I thought Page Ladson site did have evidence of mastodon in the southeast. Where does the ambiguity of the site arise from?
Yeah, they do. They've got, but the distinction I make there is they don't, to my knowledge, they don't have blood residue on the tools. I'm not saying that that they weren't used on mastodons in Florida in particular, where there seems to be more evidence than elsewhere. But yeah, I guess I would say the blood residue evidence is the first real smoking gun direct evidence of either the hunting or scavenging. Certainly having mastodon bones in a archaeological site with artifacts, stone tools like the Page Ladson, that's pretty good evidence as well.
Excellent. We've got another question. Where does the kill mode factor into this?
That's Jeff Bird, man. I tell you,
that is Jeff Bird.
Jeff Bird is a good buddy of mine. He's a farmer and a collector, lives in Marlboro County, and I told him I was going to give him a shout out. And tell you what, he turns it on, man. He finds some really amazing stuff, and I'm hoping one day he's going to let me send them off and get some blood residue done on the stuff he's found.
Yeah. I think we're all pretty amazed at the things that Mr. Bird's been finding up there on the river.
Yeah, we really are.
So I don't see any other questions just yet. Chris, are you in a mode of collecting additional points and preparing to do another study, or got to raise the money? What's the next step for you?
Yeah, right now, or I'm not actually collecting anything at the moment. I'm certainly thinking about it. I'm busy. I've been keeping pretty busy publishing papers on the whole Younger Dryas impact research that I've been involved with, which certainly ties into the whole extinction debate. But no, I haven't been able to acquire the points, but it's definitely something that I'm hoping to do in the near future. Certainly money is a big issue for that. This is an expensive process, an expensive test. But I'm hoping in the near future we can do that.
There's a question in the chat about, I think it's about Ben Ziegler's point. You mentioned that it's an exotic chert. Any idea where that chert is coming from?
We don't. It does not look anything like anything I've ever seen in South Carolina or North Carolina or Georgia, for that matter. It doesn't mean that it's not. There are, I'm sure, unknown sources, but it looks more like something maybe from out, potentially something like Ridge and Valley, something out in in those areas. We need other people to get some eyeballs on it and take a look at it. It's very unique. When Ben found it we could hardly believe our eyes when we saw that. It's unusual for so many reasons. One, it's huge. It's a and then to have the blood residue on it from Proboscidean and to have other microwear evidence on it. It's an amazing tool. It's currently, I think, on display at the Florence Museum. Ben Ziegler graciously allowed that to be put on display there if anyone wants to take a look. That is something that I would love to know is exactly what kind of chert this is.
Yeah, it's definitely an impressive piece. Question, in identifying smaller mammals on the Clovis Point, is it assumed these larger stone tools were used for hunting or butchering or preparation?
I would, for certainly things like rabbit that I talked about, I imagine there may be other hunting techniques, snares, or, things that they're using on those. But certainly, hafted Clovis knife. Many of the Clovis points we find are not big. They can be very small. And those would be more than adequate to butcher small mammals. And of course, the hafting, if they're using things like the rabbit's skin and sinew to wrap around and actually affix the Clovis to a handle, that's a possibility as well.
Okay, next up, what are your thoughts about why the megafauna went extinct in general, hunting or environmental changes?
That's still a big, big debate. This has gone on for a long time, back from the original sort of the overkill hypothesis, right? That the Paleo-Indians swept into North America. It was devoid of humans, and these animals had never seen people. They weren't afraid, and Paleo-Indians using this high technology, Clovis spear point went through and just wiped them out. Some people still subscribe to that. I mean, I've seen even recent papers that talk. It's hard to imagine because we're talking about not just mastodon or mammoth, but 35 genera of animals go extinct, on or around the same time. We don't know the timing exactly, but of course, climate is another factor people talk about. The Younger Dryas climate event, where we around 12,800 years ago, we go back into a slightly cooler glacial type climate very suddenly. Some people think, well, maybe that they couldn't handle that. It's hard to imagine they've survived so many upturns and downturns for hundreds of thousands of years, and suddenly they couldn't survive this one. And of course, there's another idea about that there was a fragmented comet that impacted with the Earth and created a global catastrophic impact winter from dust and smoke from the impacts and air burst around the planet. We're finding that's pretty far out there, I guess, as an option, but I think we're seeing evidence globally for this possible impact that may have occurred. There's a lot more work to be done before any of this is going to be really considered settled science. I mean, this is something that's been going on for a really long time.
All right. What are the most prominent types of places these artifacts tend to be found? Are they near water? Are they on hills?
Yeah, I mean, most archaeologists and collectors figure out pretty quick that proximity to water is a big one, right? If you're next to some of the major rivers and you're up on the terrace adjacent to the floodplain, things like that. But they can be found anywhere. And certainly with Paleo-Indians, we think that they moved great distances potentially in small bands across, large distances. And so they could be almost anywhere on the landscape on what would have been probably previously established animal game trails, right? Can only imagine what mammoth or mastodon and bison would have done in terms of creating trails over millennia. And so those would have been Native Americans would have come in and used those immediately to get around. And so we find evidence of that certainly for Paleoamericans, even in areas in between major rivers.
Great. Hey, thanks, Chris. I think that's it with the questions for today. Appreciate you taking the time to share this really cutting edge research with us. You got a good handful of accolades in the chat, intermixed with the questions, and keep up the good work, and we'll talk to you soon.
Great, appreciate it.
All right, take care.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.